Hey, welcome back, everybody. This is Shah. I wanted to talk about why custody and child support are generally split issues. And the reason this topic comes to mind is because I used to work at a child support agency for 5 years. I was a child support officer. And in that time, I worked with a lot of people, moms, dads, and a lot of times I'd have guys that came into the office and, we were suing them for child support. They'd owe five, 600, $1,200 a month, whatever it was going to be. And a lot of times guys would tell me, hey, she's not letting me see my kid. I don't have custody. I'm supposed to have this. Can you guys help me get custody? And the answer was always, no, sorry. You got to go across the street to the private family law courthouse and file your own motion, pay for your own, petition and all that kind of stuff and get your own custody order. It's interesting to me because child support is a federally funded program, from taxpayer dollars. And that's a program that's offered essentially for free to anyone who comes in. So some people have to pay like about $25 a year or some service fee. That's typically if they're what's called a non-welfare case. Child support is provided to the public at the expense of the taxpayer dollar. However, custody doesn't avail itself of the same privilege. So if you're dealing with a custody issue, you might be paying child support, but the agency is going to do nothing. No one's going to help you get custody. You have to pay for that out of your own pocket. So I wanted to discuss the history of child support and its creation as an agency and maybe shed some light on why that split exists. So to do that, I found this pretty cool study which was looking at the efficacy of the child support program. And it has a nice background section which discusses the child support program creation and kind of why that split exists. So let's go and read this together, and I'll try to elucidate where I can. In 1950, when only a small minority of children were in mother-only families, the federal government took its first steps into the child support arena. Congress amended the Aid to Families with Dependent Children law by requiring state welfare agencies to notify law enforcement officials when benefits were being furnished to a child who had been abandoned by one of her parents. Presumably, local officials would then undertake to locate non-resident parents and make them pay child support. From 1950 to 1975, the federal government confined its child support efforts to these welfare children. With this exception, most Americans thought that child support establishment and collection was a domestic relations issue that should be dealt with at the state level by the courts. This paragraph kind of has a lot packed into it, but what's important to know is that, after World War II, there were a lot of families out there where the husband had died, on the battlefield, and the mother was widowed and they had children at home and they weren't able to take care of themselves. So around that time, we saw the creation of the welfare program, which was originally intended and designed to support these families who had encountered that circumstance. But as time went on and we got to the mid 70s, the government started to notice that the people who were receiving welfare weren't just women who had lost their husbands. It was women whose husbands, or not husbands, but whose fathers of their children, because maybe they were never married, were actually still alive and just not living with them and not supporting their kids. So the government seeing this huge problem that's ballooning of taxpayer dollars going to take care of these kids, and the fathers are actually still alive. The second most important thing to understand about this is that it talks about the federal program and how from the perspective of the federal government, it's pretty much seen as child support is dealt with from local courts. It's at the state level. There is no top-down child support system, okay? And what's really important about this that I think people should know is back in these times, even though you could be ordered to pay child support, the local courts had enough dexterity to be able to look at your case with whatever nuances and special circumstances had to do with it and be able to make a decision and see what's fair, right? Later on, as this problem gets worse with children born out of wedlock, in the mid 70s, it was about 5% in 1950, and then it started hitting like 25% in the 70s. Nowadays, it's at about 40%, higher than 40% actually. And what happened is you then saw the creation of the child support system, which is a federal program. So that's top down, right? And it created these standardized rules that basically work across the nation, which leaves less dexterity for your local courts to be able to make decisions in your child support case because they have to follow these guidelines put forth by them from the federal government. So let's get back to this. By the early 1970s, however, Congress recognized that the composition of the AFDC caseload had changed. In earlier years, the majority of children needed financial assistance because their fathers had died. By the 1970s, the majority needed aid because their parents were separated, divorced, or never married. The Child Support Enforcement and Paternity Establishment Program, or CSE for short, enacted in 1975, was a response by Congress to reduce public expenditures on welfare by obtaining support from non-custodial parents on an ongoing basis. To help non-AFDC families get support so they could stay off public assistance, and to establish paternity for children born outside marriage so child support could be obtained for them. Trying to answer our overall question here of why is custody separate from child support, it's important to understand why the child support program was created in the first place. And what we see from this paper here is it was just about recouping public assistance or welfare dollars that were being expended out to these families. So that program really was created as a response to try to get the welfare money back. The way going about this was, let's get it back from the quote unquote deadbeat dads who aren't taking care of their children, and then let's put that money back, in the hands of the government in order to recoup some of that. Another kind of aside is the understanding of paternity. I could probably do a whole separate video on paternity, and that'll be coming soon. But essentially, back when only 5% of kids were born out of wedlock, and most families, who were making kids were actually married to each other, paternity wasn't an issue, because if a child was born to two parents who were married, it's just assumed that the husband is the paternal father of the child, and there's no dispute about it. But as we started seeing this trend of kids being born outside of marriage, especially in the 60s, and you got all these, changes in what the culture valued, and you started seeing these things, you started having a lot of kids that were born outside of a marriage and were illegitimate children. And the government saw this, and, how can you charge someone child support or tell someone to take care of a kid if you don't know who the legal father is? So we started seeing a creation of a program to help establish paternity early on, and that's how we got things like the Voluntary Declaration of Paternity program, which, if you two aren't married and you're in a hospital, they'll give you these forms. It's called a Voluntary Declaration of Paternity. And if you sign that at the hospital, that gets sent to the state, and it has literally the same weight as a legal finding, making you the father, right? So that didn't exist before this time. And the only way before this time for someone to be a father was either through marriage, or if someone brought it to court and a judge said, you're the dad, and they would need a lot of evidence, right? There were no genetic tests at this time. The 1975 legislation, Public Law 93-647, added a new Part D to Title IV of the Social Security Act. This statute, as amended, authorizes federal matching funds to be used for enforcing support obligations by locating non-resident parents, establishing paternity, establishing child support awards, and collecting child support payments. Since 1981, child support agencies have also been permitted to collect spousal support on behalf of custodial parents, and in 1984, they were required to petition for medical support as part of most child support orders. So that paragraph right there pretty much clearly outlines what the duties of the child support program was. It was to help establish paternity, because we can't charge child support if we don't know who the dad is. So our job as a child support agency is to basically start lawsuits to sue people who are alleged fathers, and then have a court and a judge, stamp it and sign off on it saying, yes, this person's the father. And then once we get that, we can say, well, now we want this much a month being paid for the kids. The important thing about that paragraph is it says nothing about facilitating custody between the parents, right? It's just about finding out who the dad is, and then getting these payments for both child support and medical support. And what's funny is that when the child support program was first created, it was really only created to service families that were on welfare. And it wasn't till later that some laws were added to where the child support program would also start advertising to non-welfare families their services, because the thought process was families that are broken are more susceptible to receiving welfare. If we can advertise our services now, get them to come in and try to get a child support order going, it might prevent them from going on the welfare program. But the key thing to know here is that the child support agencies really only exist in order to recoup these taxpayer dollars. Basic responsibility for administering the program is left to states, but the federal government plays a major role in dictating the major design features of state programs, funding, monitoring, and evaluating state programs, providing technical assistance, and giving direct assistance to states in locating absent parents and obtaining support payments. The program requires the provision of child support enforcement services for both welfare and non-welfare families, and requires states to publicize frequently through public service announcements the availability of child support enforcement services, together with information about the application fee and a telephone number or address to obtain additional information. Local family and domestic courts and administrative agencies handle the actual establishment and enforcement of child support obligations, according to federal, state, and local laws. You know, what's important to note about that is the federal government has a lot of say on how the child support programs in each individual state is run. Each individual state crafts its own program, but there is a federal office of child support enforcement that they report to that oversees all of this. And they use this carrot and stick approach. If you don't have a functioning child support program in your state, the federal government will not give you welfare funds to use for a welfare program, at least not federal welfare funds. So states are heavily incentivized to have a child support program and to meet certain goals and expectations, such as establishing paternity for a high percentage of kids born out of wedlock, collecting on child support payments, all these things. And if they don't meet these criteria, then they're basically, punished by the government, either with reductions in the amount of welfare funds they're going to receive, or potentially they could lose that welfare program if they're not doing anything on the child support end. And this is interesting because the child support program is incentivized to meet these numbers. So they're incentivized to establish paternity. They are not incentivized to figure out who the right father is. They're incentivized to establish paternity. Okay, that's important to know. It might not be something they consciously are aware of, but they're trying really hard to find a father for the kid. And that happens in more ways than just a genetic test saying you're the father. You know what I mean? It could default on you. It could be sent to a judge, and the judge could say, well, you're in the kid's life for 2 years. You're the father, even though you never legally were. Or, you're the husband. We know you're the father, even though you're not genetically the father. You're still the father. But these are just important things to note. The child support program generally does not provide services aimed at other issues between parents, such as property settlement, custody, and access to children. These issues are handled by local courts with the help of private attorneys. So see, that's really the key area right there. The question might be, well, why is that? And I guess you have to look at the creation of governmental laws and procedures as more a matter of necessity instead of some sort of result of looking at what's right or what's really the moral thing to do, and let's base it off ultimate justice or something like that. Prior to all these children being born out of wedlock, most families, most men and women were married, and they were having kids within a married household. And it was like this for a long time. There were huge stigmas for having a child out of wedlock. There are huge stigmas both on the woman and the guy. You used to have shotgun marriages back then, where if you're a guy and we knew you were the one who got her pregnant, you better marry her, and no other woman's going to want to have nothing to do with you if they know that you're out there doing this kind of stuff. So both the man and the woman had incentives to get married. Divorce laws were radically different back then, so it was harder to get divorced. But the point I'm trying to make is there were very little amount of divorces. If divorce was going to happen, it could only happen if it was seen in front of a judge. And if it's seen in front of a judge, then all these issues like custody and support for the kids and property, all that stuff gets ironed out there, privately, right? As these kids start getting born out of wedlock, the federal government's seeing that, and they're just seeing the money being expended, and they're like, well, we got to freaking get some of this money back. Like, we got to figure out who these dads are. But they didn't care about custody because that's not what they are worried about. There's already this private legal framework to figure out custody. And if someone, wasn't the husband at the time, they couldn't even really claim custody anyways, unless they established themselves as the father. There's a lot more here, and the story of the child support program and its impact is actually a very interesting one. It's one I plan to talk about. If you guys really knew how the system operates, I think you guys would be really, really surprised. I think there's a huge lack of education out there, especially for young men. I used to meet so many guys that just kind of derailed their life getting stuck in the child support program. And in my opinion, there are a lot of things that are fine with it, but also wrong with it. It's definitely a topic you see in the news all the time, whether it's from celebrities and all these kinds of things. But I think we need a reimagining of the child support program. To give you guys a kind of higher order philosophy here and kind of how I see this stuff, and this is stuff I plan to expound on more later, so remember to subscribe if you want to hear more. The child support system really represented the first public family law system, as opposed to a private family law system. Prior to this, all marriages, divorces, and custody and child support was all in the purview of private family law, which is something you typically hire an attorney for, and you typically pay the courts to hear in order to get, this in front of a judge. But the child support program marked a significant change in where you now have a public family law system. And then in the mid-90s, you see the child support system expand significantly, and it really gets its teeth, and it becomes this gargantuan system. There was this lady, I believe her name was Marilyn Smith, but she went and spoke in front of Congress, and her whole argument was that child support needs to be as powerful as the IRS. So in the mid-90s, they really beefed up the child support system to be as powerful as the IRS. So now what you see is this huge public family law system that exists that's almost like a behemoth, and it's bullied its way into the private family law system. And that's how you get these cases where you see like Britney Spears paying $40,000 a month, Kevin Costner, Tyrese Gibson. You see all these high-profile cases now where people who ostensibly have a lot of money are complaining about the child support system. And from one sense, it's like, well, they're rich. That's too bad. Take care of your kids. But from another sense, there's this lost era of where courts used to have the ability to look at a specific family situation and make a decision that was more reasonable. Now what you have are these federal standardized laws that everyone is beholden to. And I kind of imagine it like a giant tractor or something that's moving a bunch of dirt, And when that tractor comes in and picks up all that dirt, there's going to be that teeth there that lock together, and whoever's caught there is going to get crushed really badly. But we're just trying to move as much of this dirt as possible, and if you get kind of screwed over from the system, sorry, you know what I mean? Where if it was still in private family law, the judge and the attorneys can look at it differently. But now these federal laws override a lot of what private family law could do. And, in my personal opinion, I think that custody should be something that's also funded from taxpayer dollars. Right now, if you're a father and you're trying to get custody or partial custody of a child, you have to go the private family law route. You have to pay the courts to hear your case. You probably have to hire a private attorney. You have to pay to file all these different, petitioning documents, summons and motions and all these kinds of things. And it's really hard to do that. Where if someone's looking for child support, all you do is walk into the agency and it's all federally funded. They pay it for you and you can get your child support that way, just sitting back at home and waiting for it. I think there should be some kind of federal program that helps fathers, or at least funds this issue of custody to help bring these families together. Now, I just mean it should help them get it in front of a court and pay for that. I don't think someone should be entitled to custody because, a guy can get a woman pregnant She gives birth to the baby. 9 months later, she hasn't seen him again. And it takes the child support agency a year or two to find this guy, let alone establish an order. This kid's like 2.5, 3. He's never even seen his dad. We can't just have dad come up in here and take this kid out of this house and all of a sudden into another house. A judge needs to look at the situation and make a decision. But I think in the interest of getting fathers back in children's lives, there should be some kind of reimagining of the system that helps to facilitate that. Because right now, I mean, it is very expensive. It's time consuming, and it's doubly hard if you're already paying child support, which can take a big part of your income. You know, I used to do that all the time, and I'm very familiar with the guideline and how it works and what guys are typically paying. But when you're paying that, also paying all these private family law fees, it can be so much that a guy just abandons the idea of trying to get custody. You know what I mean? So I definitely think that the child support program and even marriage and family law need a reimagining. You know, the story of child support is actually very fascinating for how it started and how it grew, how it became beefed up, and how it's impacted things, which I definitely plan to talk more about on this channel. So remember to hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, and we'll see you on the next one.